Today, we're diving into binge eating disorder, or BED, and its deep, often invisible ties to our mental health. We're going to unpack why this really common disorder so often goes completely under the radar and how it's tied up with a whole bunch of other conditions. And we know this because of a fascinating study that went straight to the leading experts. Okay, so first things first, let's get a really clear definition on the table. It's so important we're on the same page, because binge eating disorder is not just overeating. According to the official diagnosis, there are three key parts: eating a lot of food in a short time, feeling a total loss of control while it's happening, and then afterwards, feeling really intense distress, guilt, or shame.
But here's the number that just blew me away. 97%. That's the estimated percentage of people who have binge eating disorder but never actually get a formal diagnosis. Think about that. This isn't just an underdiagnosed issue, it's practically a hidden one.
So, to really get our heads around this, here's our game plan. We'll start with why it's so often missed. Then we'll look at the experts who helped figure all this out. After that, we'll dig into the connections with depression and anxiety, then zoom out to a wider web of disorders, and we'll wrap it all up with a really clear, actionable solution.
All right, let's jump into that first big topic, an undiagnosed disorder. This brings up the most obvious question. If it's this common, why on earth is it so frequently missed? Well, this really gets to the heart of it. A huge part of it is the secrecy. The shame and guilt are so intense that the episodes almost always happen when someone is completely alone. But the numbers here tell an even deeper story. Over 2/3 of people with BED don't even think they need treatment. And because of that, a staggering 87% never even try to get help. The disorder literally builds its own walls to stay hidden.
So, if people aren't coming forward, how in the world do we get a clear picture of what's going on? Well, the study we're looking at went right to the source, the absolute top experts on BED in the world. So who are these people, and how did the researchers tap into their knowledge?
The researchers set an incredibly high bar. I mean, they weren't just talking to anyone, they were targeting top-tier researchers, people with major government grants and tons of publications. Plus, they went after leading clinicians. We're talking award winners and people on the executive boards of major organizations. This was serious business.
And this was the final group of experts, a mix of PhDs, medical doctors, and dietitians, and most of them were fellows of the Academy of Eating Disorders. The takeaway here is simple. The insights we're about to get into come from people who are at the very top of their field. Okay, let's dive into the findings. And we're going to start with the two conditions that the experts all agreed were fundamentally linked to binge eating disorder: depression and anxiety. And you know what? The data backs them up big time. This table shows the overlap from a bunch of different studies, and the numbers are just staggering. I mean, look at those ranges. In some groups, almost 70% of people with BED also have a mood disorder, and up to 65% have an anxiety disorder. This is not a small overlap. For so many people, these things are completely intertwined. This quote from one of the experts just hits the nail on the head. Because of all the stigma, you're way more likely to tell your doctor you're feeling depressed than you are to talk about binge eating. So what happens? The doctor treats the depression, but the eating disorder, which might be driving that depression, stays completely hidden in the shadows.
So it's like a chicken and egg problem, right? The experts describe this really complex feedback loop. Binge eating can be a way to kind of numb out or cope with depressive feelings. But at the same time, the patterns of eating can cause nutritional deficiencies that actually contribute to depression. And then you layer on this intense focus on body weight and shape, which is a huge driver of depression all on its own. It's a vicious cycle.
But the story doesn't end with depression and anxiety, not even close. The experts were really clear that to understand BED, you have to look at a much wider web of connections, and that includes things like ADHD and PTSD. And this table really shows you how wide that web is. There's a significant overlap with ADHD, with post-traumatic stress disorder, and with various substance use disorders. Yeah, the rates can vary a lot from study to study, but even at the low end of these ranges, the connection is too strong to just ignore. So what's the link with ADHD? Well, one expert suggested it might be about what's going on under the hood. Core features of ADHD, things like impulsivity, problems with planning, and how the brain responds to rewards, these might be the very same things that make someone more vulnerable to developing binge eating disorder.
The experts also made a really important point about obsessive-compulsive disorder, or OCD. While you can see some similar traits like obsessive thinking in BED, they said that a full-blown OCD diagnosis is way more common and relevant in other eating disorders, like anorexia and bulimia. It's a subtle difference, but a really important one.
This quote is just perfect. It captures the challenge when BED and addiction show up together. An expert shared this analogy they hear from patients. If you treat one problem but not the other, it's like a game of whack-a-mole. You get the substance use under control and bam, the binge eating gets worse. You work on the eating disorder and bam, the addiction flares up. And when it came to PTSD, the experts were incredibly clear about the cause and effect. Trauma, especially trauma that happens early in life, very often comes first. It acts like a risk factor or a precursor that can make a person much more vulnerable to developing an eating disorder later on as a way to cope.
Okay, so we've looked at this incredibly complex web, connecting depression, anxiety, ADHD, trauma, addiction. So let's pull all these threads together. What's the real takeaway from all this? If you only remember one thing from all of this, let it be this. Binge eating disorder is not an isolated problem about food. The evidence, from the experts and from all the big studies, shows it almost never exists on its own. It's almost always part of a much larger interconnected mental health picture.
And that, of course, leads us to the most critical question of all. If BED is this complex, this interconnected, and this hidden, what do we do about it? What's the solution?
Well, the expert's conclusion points to a very clear, practical answer: two-way screening. What that means is, first, anyone who seeks help for any mental health issue, like depression, should also be screened for BED. And second, anyone being treated for BED needs to be thoroughly screened for this whole web of other conditions. It absolutely has to be a two-way street.
And why does this matter so much? Well, this is how we find those millions of people who are currently undiagnosed. This is how we stop playing that frustrating game of whack-a-mole, where working on one problem just makes another one pop up. At the end of the day, this kind of integrated care is what actually leads to real, lasting recovery.
So we'll leave you with this last thing to think about. If mental health isn't a bunch of separate boxes, but instead this intricate, tangled web of connections, are we making a huge mistake every time we focus on treating just a single thread?